Self-regulation, the idea that an industry will police itself effectively for public health gain. But does it work? Is it effective? So theoretically, and kind of the assumption behind self-regulation is that alcohol marketing needs some restrictions to protect vulnerable populations from its effects. So in a way, the alcohol industry is actually conceding a public health point, saying that yes, our marketing can be dangerous to some people, and we need to protect them in some way, shape, or form. So does it work? Now, the simple answer and the most straightforward answer is no. Straight off, no. In a review that was published in 2017, they looked at 19 studies that looked at the content guidelines of these self-regulated alcohol advertising codes. 15 of these studies, 75%, said self-regulation was ineffective. None, not a single one of these 19 studies concluded self-regulation was effective. So the simple answer is that alcohol marketing self-regulation doesn't work. But it is more complex. It's never quite that straightforward, unfortunately. So the more complex answer is that it depends. Are you talking about regulating the ad content, or are you talking about who's actually exposed to these ads? Are you talking about who, like TV, radio, print, digital media? So let's go into that in a little bit more detail. So when we talk about magazine advertising, they're largely compliant with the exposure rules. Now, if you remember from a previous video, the core guideline that all alcohol marketing self-regulated guidelines follow are IARD's guiding principles. Now, in IARD's guiding principles, they say that the audience that is exposed to an ad can be no more than 30% under the minimum legal purchase age. So in the United States, no more than 30% of the audience of any given ad can be under the age of 21. Now, these magazine ads are largely compliant with those rules. However, there is high levels of exposure among ads that are seen by 20%, that have underage audiences of 20%, 25%, 27%, 28%. They don't necessarily go over that 30% mark, but they come up very, very close to it. And because it's a magazine ad, they actually have a lower risk of violating the guidelines. There's actually one study out there saying that of the ads that they reviewed, none of them had a violation of these content guidelines. Now, all of these studies that looking at the content are very restricted. There's not a huge sample size, but it is interesting nonetheless. And it's really kind of straightforward. There's just not as much going on in a print ad to trigger a violation as a TV ad or an online ad might have. Now, when it comes to TV advertising, there are much higher rates of non-compliance in terms of the exposure guidelines of these self-regulated codes compared to magazine ads. So the data is not necessarily the most up-to-date, but we assume that about a third of all ad impressions, and an impression is simply every time someone sees an ad, are non-compliant. And even among ads that are compliant, we see increasing youth exposure over time. So it's almost like even if they're compliant, they've set the bar so high or so low, depending on how you want to look at it, that they're never going to cross it. And there are much higher rates of guideline violations of the content guidelines compared to magazine ads. So the most recent studies have concluded that 80, 85, 86% of all ads contain at least one violation of these content guidelines of these self-regulated alcohol marketing codes. Now, when we talk about digital marketing, now digital advertising and digital marketing is the new era. It's not necessarily new in that it hasn't, it's been around for a while, but it's more recent than TV and radio. It's certainly newer than TV and radio. It's non-traditional, particularly on social media. But we don't have a lot of information about advertising on digital media. We know that youth see them. We know that they're aware of digital media. They're aware of alcohol-branded websites. They're aware of alcohol-branded social media accounts. And of the studies that have been done, we see very high rates of the violations of the content guidelines. So about 3/4 of all the UK websites reviewed in a 2011 paper contain at least one violation of the relevant guidelines. Over 80% of Bud Light and Budweiser pages or ads, had at least one violation in a study published in 2017. So we need more information on digital advertising, but it's looking to be very similar to TV advertising in terms of violating these self-regulation codes. Now, a key question of all of this is, we tend to want to be against self-regulation. We tend not to want an industry to police itself. Now, it has worked in some industries, but it doesn't seem to be working in alcohol marketing. So the question is, are these partial bans, are more restrictive policies that allow alcohol marketing, but don't completely ban it entirely, more effective than self-regulation? Depending on what the content is, the answer is yes and no, but more often than not, partial bans are not more effective than self-regulation. So in this study, it was looking at advertising during the FIFA World Cup tournament in about 8 different countries. 6 of those countries actually had advertising. One country was France with OIFN. There were no advertising to begin with. The other was Finland, which simply didn't have any for kind of random reasons. I don't exactly know why. But for the 6 countries that had advertising, they were divided by policy restrictiveness based on that chart in a previous video with the World Health Organization media types and types of restrictions that were put in place. Everything was coded, and types of violations of IARD's guiding principles, which are over on the left side of the screen, were tested across these different restrictiveness categories. And in one case, you actually have more violations in one guideline, the more restrictive the policy got. In another case, you had more targeting of minors in these least restrictive countries, which is essentially self-regulation. But overall, when you take all of this together, there's really no difference in the types of advertising that is going on in low restrictive countries and high restrictive countries that still allow alcohol marketing. It really seems that you may actually need a full ban in order to eliminate the ability of the alcohol industry and alcohol marketers to find loopholes and get around these guidelines.